The morning the widow made her choice, the town woke uneasy, as if the river fog had learned how to whisper. Folks later swore they felt it before they heard it. That tight pull behind the ribs that comes when something long avoided steps into daylight. The bell over Ashford's general store rang once, then went still, and even the horses tied along the hitching post stamped as if warned. In a place where everyone knew the weight of each other's sorrow, news traveled fast, and fear traveled faster. Abigail Crow had buried her husband to winter's back, the ground hard as iron and the sky white with cold. Since then, she kept her grief close, like a shawl drawn tight. She was not a woman who cried in public. She worked the small orchard behind her clapboard house, fixed her own fence rails, and carried herself with a quiet that made people lower their voices. They called her a grieving widow, but they also called her steady, and in a town that prized steadiness, that meant something. It meant you were allowed to be alone without being pitied. The cage sat at the edge of town, near the old quarry where the wind never rested. It was built of iron bars and shames set up years ago after a fire nobody would name outright. Children dared each other to run close, then bolted back, hearts pounding, laughing too loud. Adults pretended the cage was a necessary thing, a warning made solid. The man inside had a name once, but people stopped saying it. They called him the caged man, or worse, the thing everyone feared. He stood tall, even bent by the bars, broad-shouldered, eyes dark with a patience that unsettled. Some said he had the strength of 3 men. Some said he had a curse. No one said he had a voice worth hearing. Abigail passed the cage every market day. She never looked long, but she never hurried either. The first time, she felt the weight of those eyes like a hand at her back. The second time, she smelled soap, plain and clean, and it struck her as wrong in a place meant to rot. The third time, she heard him speak to a crow perched on the bars, a low murmur, careful, as if words were scarce. That night, she dreamed of iron opening. Old American towns are built on stories told until they harden. This one told itself that fear kept them safe. Reverend Thorne Ashford preached order from his pulpit, his voice ringing like a bell struck true. Sheriff Calder, no kin to Abigail, despite the shared name, kept the key to the cage on a chain beneath his vest. He said it was a burden he carried for everyone. People nodded and looked away. When the wind cut sharp, they told themselves the cold was worse outside the bars. Abigail's house was warm but quiet. Her husband's boots still waited by the door, cleaned and unused. Grief is a careful tenant. It moves your furniture and asks nothing. One evening, Abigail stood at her table and realized she had spoken aloud to no one all day. She set down her knife, the apple rolling to a stop against the grain. Outside, a train whistle sounded far off, a reminder that other lives kept moving. She wrapped her shawl and went out, the path taking her where she said she would never go. The caged man did not startle when he saw her. He inclined his head, a gesture more polite than most she'd received in months. Up close, the scars were old and pale, lines earned long before the bars. When he spoke, it was to ask if she needed help. The question, simple as it was, felt like a crack in a wall. She told him her name. He told her his. Ezekiel Holt. It sounded like something that could be carried without. Breaking, they spoke of small things at first, whether apples, how iron sings when the frost sets in. Abigail brought him bread the next day, and the day after that. People noticed. They always do. Whispers gathered like leaves against a fence. Some said the widow was touched by sorrow, that grief had loosened her sense. No one asked her why. He spoke of being blamed because blame needed a body. He spoke of standing when others ran, of carrying a child out of smoke. He did not ask her to believe him. He only said that fear had found him useful. Abigail listened, the way she once listened to her husband by the hearth, the way listening becomes an act of courage. When she left, she carried the weight of a truth that did not fit the town's telling. The talk grew louder when Abigail went to Sheriff Calder and asked for a license. Married the caged man everyone feared and shocked the entire town. Became a phrase hissed through teeth and printed by a traveling paper eager for scandal. Calder laughed at first, then stopped when he saw her face. He warned her of consequences. He spoke of safety. He spoke of law. She told him she was done letting her life be shaped by other people's fear. On Sunday, Reverend Ashford spoke of obedience and the dangers of false mercy. Abigail sat straight-backed in the pew, her hands folded. When the service ended, folks formed a line not to greet her, but to block her path. Words were thrown like stones, careful not to draw blood. She walked through them anyway. The echo of Ezekiel's quiet voice steadying her steps. The marriage was held at the edge of town, under a sky that could not make up its mind. There was no music, no feast. Just a justice of the peace who cleared his throat too often, and a cage that did not belong in a vow. Abigail spoke her promise without shaking. Ezekiel answered in a voice that carried farther than anyone expected. When the words were done, the wind rose, rattling iron like a warning bell. Some swore they saw the bars bend. Others swore they did not. Life after did not soften. Children were kept inside. Dogs were leashed tighter. Yet something shifted. Apples left on Abigail's step did not rot. A broken wheel was mended in the night. The crow returned, bolder now, hopping along the bars. People told themselves coincidence was kinder than change. Still, they watched. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the quarry, Sheriff Calder stood alone with the key heavy in his hand. He thought of the stories he had told himself to sleep. He thought of the child saved from smoke. He thought of the widow's eyes, clear as river water after rain. The wind pushed at the cage once, twice, a question asked by iron, in town. Doors closed and opened, choices made quiet and loud. Abigail waited, her shawl folded, her heart steady. Sheriff Calder lowered his hand, the metal cold against his palm, and stepped back, as if the cage itself had spoken. He said nothing to Abigail, only nodded once, a hard motion that carried warning and apology together. The wind eased, but the sound of iron lingered in the ears of those close enough to hear it. When he walked away, his boots left shallow prints that filled slowly with dust, as if the ground meant to forget he had been there. Abigail returned home alone, her thoughts louder than the quiet rooms. Marriage had not brought relief. It had sharpened everything. She sat by the stove and remembered the early days with her husband, the way love then had been simple and believed by everyone. This love was different. It was watched. It was measured. It was doubted. She wondered if courage always felt this much like standing at the edge of something that might break. Ezekiel felt the town shift before he saw it. Men who once spat near the cage now lingered, pretending to check their boots. Women whispered prayers not meant for him but said loud enough to reach his ears. He spent his days repairing what he could inside the bars, bending wire, oiling hinges that did not belong to him. At night, he spoke softly to the crow, telling it stories of rivers that ran clear in hills. Where no one locked the sky away, Abigail began to visit at dawn instead of market hour. She brought bread and apples, sometimes a book she read aloud, her voice steady. Ezekiel listened like a man gathering water in a dry land. He told her more of his past, but always in pieces, as if laying out a map too fast might invite someone to tear it. He had been a blacksmith once, strong hands shaping useful things. Fire had obeyed him then. Now fire was the word people used to cage him. The town council met in the back room of the general store, the air thick with smoke and grievance. Reverend Thorne Ashford spoke first, his voice smooth as varnish. He said the Widows' Act challenged order. He said mercy without judgment invited ruin. Others nodded, faces drawn by fear they mistook for wisdom. One man said the cage should be moved farther out. Another said the marriage was a mockery. Sheriff Calder listened, jaw set, the key heavy at his chest. Rumors began to circle like vultures. Someone claimed to have seen the bars bent wider. Someone else said livestock had gone missing. Each story fed the next, until truth wore a stranger's clothes. Abigail felt the weight of eyes when she walked, but she kept her pace. She fixed her fence again after it was kicked loose. She found her orchard gate open one morning and closed it without a word. Grief had taught her how to endure without asking permission. A storm came hard one night, rain hammering the roof like fists. Lightning split the sky above the quarry, and thunder rolled so close it shook the cage. Ezekiel stood braced, the iron slick under his hands. In the flash, he saw Sheriff Calder watching from a distance, hat pulled low, torn between duty and something like doubt. When the storm passed, the cage still stood, but the lock showed a new scratch, bright and fresh. The next day, Abigail found a note tucked beneath her door. It was unsigned, the letters pressed deep as if carved by anger. It warned her to leave well enough alone. It said some cages were built for a reason. She burned it in the stove and watched the paper curl into nothing. Fear, she knew, thrived on being kept whole. Ezekiel began to notice small kindnesses offered in secret. A blanket folded just inside reach? These gestures did not announce themselves. They were done by hands that did not want to be seen. The town was not a single mind. It never had been. It was a field of weather, changing by the hour. Abigail sought out old records in the courthouse, dust rising as she opened ledgers no one had touched in years. Names and dates blurred together, but patterns emerged. Fires blamed on accidents that followed arguments. Charges that stuck without testimony. She traced Ezekiel's story back to a night when the town needed a culprit more than it needed truth. Each page felt like lifting a stone and finding something alive beneath it. Sheriff Calder found her there, his shadow long in the narrow room. He asked what she hoped to find. She told him she hoped to understand. He looked at the floor, then at the shelves, as if answers might hide in the wood grain. He spoke of the night of the fire, how the crowd had moved like a single animal, how stopping it would have meant standing alone. His voice was quiet, and that quiet carried shame. The preacher called for a day of fasting and prayer, urging the town to cleanse itself. The words were meant to gather people, but they also drew lines. Those who came stood shoulder to shoulder. Those who did not were marked in memory. Abigail stayed home, kneading dough, the rhythm calming her thoughts. Ezekiel watched the procession from behind bars, his faces passing like a river he could not cross. A traveling man arrived with a cart of wares and news from elsewhere. He told of towns that had torn down their cages and found themselves stronger for it. Some listened. Others scoffed. Stories like seeds, land where they will. That night, someone painted a warning near the quarry, the letters crude and loud. By morning, rain had blurred them into something unreadable. Abigail dreamed of iron again. But this time it was a door opening onto light she could not see clearly. She woke before dawn and walked to the cage, shawl tight. Ezekiel met her gaze through the bars, a question in his eyes. She told him of the records, of the patterns. He nodded, not surprised. Truth had been a long companion to him, patient and quiet. The crow took flight as footsteps approached. Sheriff Calder emerged from the fog, the key visible now, no longer hidden. He did not lift it. He did not pocket it either. He stood there, caught between past and future, the town's breath held with his. Somewhere a bell rang, not to warn, but to mark the hour. Abigail felt the tension coil tighter, every choice pressing closer. The lock gleamed, untouched. As voices rose in the distance, and the day leaned toward something that had not yet chosen a name. The bell that rang that morning did not belong to the church. It was the iron bell by the rail yard, struck by a careless hand or an unsteady wind. Once its sound rolled through town like a warning that refused to explain itself. People paused mid-step. Cups froze halfway to lips. Even the dogs lifted their heads. By the quarry the cage stood as it always had. Yet something about it felt newly fragile, like a promise tested by time. Sheriff Calder spent the early hours walking streets he had known since boyhood. Every board, every stone had a memory tied to it, and today those memories pressed hard. He remembered his father telling him that peace was kept by firm hands. He remembered learning which questions not to ask. The key at his chest knocked softly with each step, a reminder that authority could weigh more than iron. Abigail worked her orchard with deliberate care. Fingers numb from the morning chill, the trees were bare, but she pruned them anyway, trusting the work would matter later. Grief had taught her that tending to living things was an act of faith. Neighbors watched from a distance, some with curiosity, others with judgment sharpened by fear. She did not look back. The orchard was her ground. Earned through seasons of loss and effort, Ezekiel felt the tension like a storm gathering beyond the hills. He sensed it in the way the birds kept low, and the way footsteps approached, then retreated. He had learned patience in the cage, a patience that did not mean surrender. When he closed his eyes, he saw the forge of his past, the glow of coals, the steady rhythm of hammer on steel. He remembered making tools meant to last, things shaped to help others build. That memory steadied him when the present threatened to splinter. The council met again, louder this time. Reverend Thorne Ashford warned that doubt spread faster than fire. He spoke of order as if it were a fragile heirloom that only he could hold. Others argued that the widow's marriage had exposed a lie they could no longer carry. The room grew hot with clashing truths. Sheriff Calder stood apart, listening, his silence noted and resented. A boy named Elias Rowan lingered near the cage after school, his satchel heavy with books. He had been there the night of the fire years ago, hidden behind a barrel, eyes wide as smoke curled upward. He remembered Ezekiel carrying a child through the flames, remembered the crowd turning before the truth could land. Elias had grown with that memory pressing against his ribs. Now, older and less willing to be quiet, he set his satchel down and spoke to Ezekiel through the bars. Asking questions that had waited too long, Abigail heard of Elias from a woman at the well, her voice low and quick. The woman said the boy was brave or foolish, depending on where you stood. Abigail smiled, a small thing that held gratitude. Courage, she had learned, often arrived without permission. That afternoon, a wagon wheel broke on the road near the quarry. Men gathered, tools scarce. Ezekiel called out an instruction, clear and calm. There was a pause, then a man followed it. The wheel was set right in minutes. The men stepped back, unsettled by how easily they had trusted a voice they were taught to fear. The cage did not hide Ezekiel's skill, only delayed its use. Rumors answered with force. Someone claimed the caged man was turning people against the town. Someone else said the widow planned to open the bars herself. Fear took these stories and dressed them as warnings. That night, stones struck Abigail's fence. She did not step outside. She sat by the window, listening, her breath even, refusing to let anger make her small. Sheriff Calder visited her at dawn, hat in hand. He spoke of pressure, of men who wanted the cage reinforced, of others who wanted it gone. He admitted he no longer knew which side kept the peace. Abigail offered him coffee. They spoke of the past, of how easy it had been to follow when following felt safe. When he left, the lines on his face had not eased, but his steps were slower, more careful. Ezekiel noticed the scratch on the lock deepen. Someone had tried again in the night, careful not to be heard. The attempt failed, but the intent lingered. He wondered if freedom would come from kindness or chaos. He wondered which would cost more. The preacher announced a gathering by the quarry, calling it a time to face fear together. People came with lanterns and tight mouths. Abigail stood at the edge, her presence a quiet challenge. Elias stood near her, shoulders squared. Sheriff Calder arrived last, the key visible now, no longer hidden by cloth. Words were spoken, sharp and smooth. Accusations flared, then cooled. Ezekiel listened from behind the bars, the lantern light cutting his face into planes of shadow and truth. When someone shouted that the cage was the only thing keeping the town safe, Ezekiel asked, simply safe from what? The question fell into the space between breaths. A woman stepped forward, trembling, and spoke of her brother lost in the fire, of the lie she had accepted because it hurt less than doubt. Another man countered with anger, saying the past could not be rewritten. The crowd swayed, pulled by grief and fear in equal measure. Sheriff Calder felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a mantle he'd never asked to wear. Abigail met Ezekiel's eyes through the bars. She did not plead. She did not demand. She stood, present and unbroken, a living argument against the story the town had told itself. The wind rose, carrying voices from the hills, and the lanterns flickered. Somewhere in the crowd, a hand tightened around a tool meant for breaking. Somewhere else, a hand loosened, choosing restraint. The town stood balanced on a narrow edge, every choice magnified by the light they held. The cage remained closed, the key unturned, as the night deepened and the question of who they were became harder to avoid. The night stretched longer than it should have, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Lanterns burned low by the quarry, their light wavering on faces pulled tight by expectation. No one wanted to be the first to leave. No one wanted to be the one who stayed too long. The cage stood between them all, iron catching the glow, holding every fear the town had learned to live with. Sheriff Calder cleared his throat, but the sound did not carry. He felt the eyes on him, measuring, waiting. The key rested against his chest like a living thing. He remembered being sworn into office, his hands steady then, his beliefs simpler. Tonight the oath felt heavier, as if it demanded more than obedience. It demanded judgment, and judgment demanded courage. Abigail felt the cold creep through her boots, but she did not shift. She thought of the winters she had survived alone, the nights she had spoken to an empty room, and kept going anyway. Love had not saved her from grief, but it had taught her how to stand in it without breaking. She saw fear ripple through the crowd and recognized it. Fear always tried to pass itself off as wisdom. Ezekiel leaned his weight back against the bars, listening to the sounds of a town deciding what it could no longer avoid. He heard the quick breath of the young and the slow sighs of the old. He knew some still wanted him gone one way or another. He also knew that others were beginning to see him not as a symbol, but as a man who had endured. That shift, small as it was, mattered. A sudden shout broke the quiet. A stone struck iron, the sharp ring slicing through the air. Another followed, then another. The sound set nerves on edge. Lanterns bobbed as people stepped back or forward, unsure which way safety lay. Sheriff Calder raised his hand, calling for calm. But his voice was swallowed by the clamor. Abigail moved closer to the cage without thinking. Elias followed, his jaw set. The preacher's voice rose above the rest, warning of chaos, urging restraint that sounded too much like command. Somewhere behind him, a man argued back, saying restraint had already cost them too much. The words tangled, anger feeding on itself. Ezekiel spoke again, louder this time, not to accuse but to remind. He spoke of work done side by side, of fires fought together, of how a town survived by trust more than locks. His voice carried across the quarry, steady and clear. For a moment, even the stones seemed to pause. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of rain. Clouds gathered low and heavy, pressing down on the night. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low warning that echoed the mood below. Sheriff Calder felt the moment slipping toward something he could no longer guide. He stepped forward, closer to the cage. The key now visible to all, Abigail watched his face, reading the conflict written there. She saw a man pulled between who he had been and who he might still become. This was his step to take. A flash of lightning lit the quarry, stark and sudden. In that brief light, everyone saw the same thing. The cage door was worn, the lock old, the iron scarred by years of weather and fear. It was not the unbreakable thing they had imagined. It was only iron, shaped by human hands. Another stone flew, closer this time, striking near Ezekiel's shoulder. A murmur rippled through the crowd, fear tipping toward regret. Elias shouted for them to stop, his young voice raw but fierce. He spoke of the night he remembered, of the truth he had carried alone. Some scoffed. Others listened, faces pale as memory stirred. Rain began to fall. Light at first, then harder, hissing against hot lantern glass. The storm closed in fast, thunder cracking overhead. People scrambled to shield flames to protect what little light they had. In the chaos, Sheriff Calder felt the press of urgency. Delay now could turn everything wrong. Abigail stepped directly in front of the cage, rain soaking her shawl, her hair plastered to her face. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She spoke of loss, of how grief had taught her that fear only grew when fed silence. She spoke of choosing love not because it was safe, but because it was right. Her words did not accuse. They invited. Ezekiel watched her, awe and worry mixing in his chest. He had never asked her to stand like this, but he knew why she did. She believed the town could be better than its worst night. That belief was a gift and a risk. Sheriff Calder closed his eyes for a brief second as rain washed his face. When he opened them, he saw not a crowd but individuals. He saw men tired of carrying old lies. He saw women who wanted their children to grow without cages in their stories. He saw those who would never be convinced, and he accepted that too. He reached for the key, fingers closing around the cold metal. The movement drew every eye. The preacher stepped forward, shouting a warning, but his voice cracked with strain. Thunder answered. Closer now, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The key rose toward the lock, then stopped. Sheriff Calder's hand trembled, not with fear alone, but with the weight of consequence. Around them, the storm raged, rain blinding, wind howling through the quarry. The lanterns flickered wildly, some going dark, plunging parts of the crowd into shadow. Ezekiel stepped closer to the door, his presence calm amid the chaos. He did not reach for the bars. He did not demand release. He waited, trusting the choice would be made for the right reason. Whatever it was, Abigail held her ground, rain running down her face like tears she refused to claim. She felt the town holding its breath with her. Somewhere beyond the storm, morning waited. Whether it would rise on a changed place or a broken one was still uncertain. The lock gleamed wet in the lantern light. The key hovered inches away. Voices rose and fell, thunder cracked again, and the storm seemed to pause, as if even the sky wanted to see what would happen next. The thunder rolled once more, then faded into a low murmur as if the storm itself had decided to listen. Sheriff Calder drew a slow breath and let it out. His hand steadied. The key slid into the lock with a sound that cut through rain and fear alike. Metal turned. The lock opened. For a heartbeat, nothing else moved. When the cage door swung free, it did so without drama. No groan of iron, no collapse of bars. Just a simple opening where there had always been a wall. Ezekiel stepped back first, giving space, his hands open at his sides. He looked not at the crowd, but at Abigail. She nodded once, a small motion that carried every promise they had made. A hush fell over the quarry. People leaned forward without realizing it. Some covered their mouths. Others clenched their fists, waiting for something terrible that did not come. Ezekiel stepped out into the rain, boots touching open ground for the first time in years. He did not run. He did not raise his arms. He simply stood, rain washing his face clean. Sheriff Calder removed his hat and held it against his chest. His voice shook when he spoke, but he spoke anyway. He said the cage was built on fear, not truth. He said the town had used one man to carry its shame because it was easier than facing itself. He said that ended tonight. The words landed heavy, then settled. Like soil after a long storm, Reverend Thorne Ashford tried to speak. But his voice was thin now, lost in the sound of rain easing into a steady fall. People were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Ezekiel. They were looking at each other, seeing neighbors instead of enemies for the first time in a long while. Elias stepped forward, rain dripping from his hair, and told the truth he had carried since boyhood. He spoke clearly, naming what he had seen, what he had never been asked to say. No one interrupted him. When he finished, a woman sobbed openly. A man bowed his head. The fire of years ago finally lost its grip. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. Clouds thinned, revealing a pale wash of moonlight. Lanterns were relit. Faces looked softer now, worn but relieved. Someone brought Ezekiel a coat. He accepted it with a quiet thank you that carried more weight than any speech. The cage stood open and empty, rain dripping from its bars. Sheriff Calder ordered it dismantled at first light. No one argued. A few even nodded, as if glad to be done with the sight of it. The key, once so heavy, felt lighter in his hand. He placed it on a rock and left it there. Life did not change all at once. It rarely does. But the morning came different. Sunlight touched the quarry without catching on iron. The cage was taken down piece by piece. The bars hauled away to be melted down and used again. Ezekiel worked the forge when it was set up, his hands sure, shaping tools from what had once been fear. Each strike of the hammer sounded like a promise kept. Abigail opened her home wider than before. The quiet rooms filled with voices, with shared meals, with laughter that surprised her when it came. Grief did not vanish, but it loosened its hold. She learned that love could grow alongside loss, not in spite of it. When people called her brave, she smiled and said she had simply chosen not to look away. Sheriff Calder resigned his post by the spring. He said the town needed a new start, and he needed to learn how to live without hiding behind duty. He stayed on as a neighbor, mending fences, offering help without authority. In time, trust found its way back to him. Reverend Thorne Ashford left soon after, his sermons no longer drawing the crowd they once had. They learned that faith lived best in action, not in fear. Elias grew into his voice. He took to writing, recording the stories of the town as they truly were, not as they wished them to be. He said memory mattered, because forgetting was how cages got built in the first place. Ezekiel and Abigail walked the town together, no longer watched as curiosities, but greeted as neighbors. Some still carried doubts, but they carried them quietly now, without power. The marriage that had shocked the entire town became a symbol of something sturdier than tradition. It became a reminder that courage could come from grief, and that healing often arrived wearing an unfamiliar face. On a warm evening, as fireflies sparked along the orchard edge, Ezekiel stood beside the forge, wiping sweat from his brow. Abigail handed him water, their fingers brushing. The sound of the hammer rang out, steady and true, shaping metal meant to build, not bind. The past did not disappear, but it no longer ruled them. The town learned, slowly and imperfectly, that fear shrank when faced together. That truth grew stronger when spoken aloud. That love, chosen in the hardest moments, could change the shape of a place, and where a cage once stood, there was only open ground, marked by grass beginning to grow.